Ambassador Neumann, Mrs. Neumann, members of the Council, guests and friends, and our special guests, members of the Maryland chapter of the Georgetown Alumni Association. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to our last session of our 1983-84 program. We won't be meeting during July and August, which is our norm, unless something very, very special happens. We anticipate that our first guest in September will be the Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the United States. We'd like to thank one of our anonymous corporate members for our reception this evening. We're delighted to have one of the nation's most distinguished authorities on the Middle East join us this evening. Ambassador Neumann enjoyed a distinguished academic career before serving as Ambassador of the United States to 3 countries, Afghanistan, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia. At present, as you all know, he's with Georgetown University's Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he serves as a senior advisor and head of the Middle Eastern program. He's held several other positions of importance at Georgetown, including, as I recall, director of their Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. He's a well-published scholar statesman. His books are several. Those of you who received the introductory flyer are familiar with some of those, and he's published in several journals. He's received honors, both academic and for his public service. In talking with the ambassador briefly concerning his visit to Baltimore, and I must say you've chosen a good day to be here. You get a good view of this city and see it at its very best. The ambassador referred to the current flare-up in the Middle East, referring, of course, to the Persian Gulf, Iran, and Iraq. That's tantalizing, of course, but he said he'd prefer to speak to what he thought was the more important, longer-term and serious question of whether there was a chance for a general peace in the Middle East. And I think that theme, is there still a chance for peace in the Middle East, is appropriate. The long-term questions are what we're concerned with most fundamentally. Some of you have read his most recent article in Foreign Affairs, I know. We look forward with great anticipation to what you have to say, Mr. Ambassador. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Council.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It is a pleasure not only to be here, but not only to have the pleasure to look at this very impressive audience, but beyond the audience onto the harbor. So if the audience annoys me, I'll look at the harbor. The title is perhaps a bit ambitious. And what I'm trying to do is to parade before you, as best as I can in a relatively brief time, what the chances and what the circumstances are as I see them. Now, when we talk about peace in the Middle East, one has to bear in mind that there are several wars going on. Many years ago, when I was a professor and was asked to give a speech a year and a half in the future, was asked to choose a title that might be timely, I chose invariably Crisis in the Middle East, and was never disappointed. Of the 4 wars, or near wars, or warlike situations that the Middle East produces at the time, I didn't listen to the radio for the last 2 hours, so I don't know what has happened then. There are, of course, 2. One is immediately flaring and will not be primarily the subject, as the chairman indicated, namely the Iran-Iraq war. The other is the broader, more long-range, more serious, more difficult situation, which is basically the Arab-Israeli conflict. I will not even pay attention to the war in the Sahara and the flare-up or not in the Chad. These are footnotes for our purposes, unless, of course, you live there. Now, on the I think in view of the publicity and the up and down in the media, which is trying to make a major crisis out of a considerable crisis in the Gulf, I would only like to say one word or a couple of words because it is so timely, and I hope that my wife will not afterwards tell me that I said more than a couple of words. After 42 years, one anticipates something. And that is that it is a serious crisis, but one, in my view, unlikely to reach major proportion. First of all, there is an oil glut in the world. Secondly, because the Iranians have no capability of really closing the Straits of Hormuz. Thirdly, because the Saudis have now shown that with the equipment that they acquired from us, they are able to safeguard their space and can even extend it. Makes one feel a little funny about all that debate in which I took such an active part about the acquisition of F-15s and AWACS, and it's very much demonstrated how much they do need it. And both the Saudis and for once our government have acted prudently, that is, not overreacted, not tried to be macho about it. At least that is true as of today. Tomorrow, who knows? But to move from that, and I'd be glad to have questions on that, but it is not the subject that we have agreed on, and I must move away to the major topic, which is far more long range. First of all, I want to underline as strongly as I possibly can that the war, both wars for that matter, the Middle East war in general, the Iran-Iraq war, are regional conflicts. They are not East-West conflicts as such. But they are conflicts in which both the United States and the Soviet Union have considerable interest. I was in Moscow a few months ago. I had other meetings, return meetings with some of the people whom I met in Moscow. And there's no question that the Soviet Union regards the Middle East as an area adjacent to their own territory, in which they have important interests. I think, press them hard, they will admit, but only fleetingly, and if nobody else is listening, that the United States and the West have perhaps a greater interest because of our dependence on the oil supplies. And what I sometimes read in the press, which is that we obtain only 3% and even from the Gulf and about 11% from the whole Middle East, is really true but irrelevant, because there are binding agreements for sharing oil supplies in case of a crisis. The supply picture gets immediately reshuffled, so we're all in the same boat. Now, the central issue in the question of possible peace in the Middle East has been, is, and remains the Palestinian problem, together with the security and the recognition of and for Israel. This has not changed, and it will not change. Having said this, I want to underline that the Palestinian problem is not just the problem of the Palestinians. It is much broader than that. It is a rallying point for any number of dissatisfied groups, dissatisfied on a great variety of subjects, some of them having nothing to do with the Palestinians or even the Middle East, but in that area. And just as in Iran, the religious element which did not win the revolution, but provided this mobilization platform, so the Palestinian problem is the mobilization point for a great variety. And it is also, as I will try to point out later, the issue on which an internal struggle takes place, namely between, I don't like the word moderate Arabs, but rather the pragmatic Arabs, and the fundamentalists, whose power and influence is growing leaps and bounds all over the area. This is why the Palestinian problem is a deeply destabilizing issue. There's a growing recognition in the entire world, including in Israel, And I've been in Israel every year after I returned from my sweep through the Arab world, that this is indeed the case. Now, in this connection, a very important event is coming up in a month, and that is the election in Israel on July 23rd. Before explaining why this is such an important event, I think more important than our election in that context, I want to spend a few minutes on what the diplomatic process is about. And those of you who are either lawyers or businessmen and have negotiated various things in business or what have you, will understand this perhaps better than others, because the process is not that different. I can think of no more nonsensical remark than the one that says, come and sit down and negotiate. Negotiate what? If you are determined not to sell your factory and somebody else wants to buy it, and you don't have a proxy fight or something, there's not going to be a deal. And nobody's going to waste his time about something that only can make him look bad, where nothing is going to happen. The same is true in diplomacy. You approach a negotiating perimeter as both sides, and sometimes they're very elaborate, secret, sometimes semi-secret ways of feeling out each other, whether there is a common area in which some agreement, compromise, or whatever is possible. And when that is identified and the parties feel comfortable or semi-comfortable that progress is possible, then negotiations can begin, otherwise not. And it is against this universal rule of diplomacy, not particularly confined to the Middle East, but from any part of the world, that I have to say categorically, and one has to become more categoric in a brief speech than if one has a whole day, to say that if the Likud government wins in Israel, there will be no peace and no negotiations. There cannot, because that common negotiating perimeter does not exist. The area about which negotiations are designed is the future of the Palestinian Arabs, primarily but not exclusively on the West Bank. If there is a possibility of give on that, then negotiations can proceed. The other side, of course, in any event, is the security and recognition and acceptance of Israel. That goes without saying, and that does not change. The first actor does change. This is not a position of good or bad. It is a matter of the deepest conviction, which those of you who have studied the history of Zionism goes back into the 20s, that one part of the Zionist movement has been determined on the question of land, and the other on the question of peace and of people. I remember a conversation with the late Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, well over 20 years ago, when we went over the various political groups in Israel, and when he talked about Mr. Menachem Begin, and I won't repeat in mixed company what he said. He said, if that man did, and he got all red in the face, if that man wins, then Israel will lose its essential mission, which it must fulfill to be a Jewish state and be a democratic state. I think in view of what happens, I don't believe I need to elaborate on that. However, after long conversations, both with the leaders of the Israeli government and with Mr. Peres and Levine and Neumann and others, without wishing to specify any particular conversation, I have come to the conclusion, and so have many others, that there is a genuine difference. That not because the one side is better than the other, not only because of the historical reasons that I have underlined earlier, but because the Labour Party, perhaps as a result of having been in opposition and had time to consider the situation, has come to the conclusion there is no future in living with 1 million Arabs, that this situation is somehow to be approached, and therefore Mr. Peres openly in many speeches, you have seen him on television, and of course in our very long conversation, has emphasized the possibility of a new approach leading to a form of territorial compromise. Now that means to the diplomat, not that peace is tomorrow, but that the window to negotiations could, in that event, and of course no election is exactly predictable, in that event the negotiating window may open a crack. And the tragedy of the Middle East, the country of so many missed opportunities, is that these opportunities don't last very long. And they have to be utilized, and of course they can be utilized only the outcome of the election is what right now it looks it will be, but these things can change. I emphasize once again that unless there is a possibility of a credible negotiating approach to a territorial revision, and I don't want to be pushed now what precisely it has to be. That has to be the result of the negotiations themselves. There can be no negotiations because nobody is interested in autonomy, even if it were real, and what has been offered is not for real. If you have nothing to say about land, if you have nothing to say about water, if you have nothing to say about settlement, what's autonomy? At any rate, that part of the Camp David process is dead, and I will come back to that. But another process is opening. The Labour Party recognizes it. The Reagan administration is recognizing. Now, eventually, negotiations have to be direct because they will be enormously difficult. And we cannot be, and ought not to be, the intermediaries. We should help, we should participate, because with all the blows to our prestige, much of it self-inflicted, we're still the only country that has credibility on both sides. And long discussions with the Russians about that. They said if you don't have diplomatic relations with Israel, you cannot have credibility on both sides, so don't complain if you do not have a central place. But in any event, there are two reasons why the direct negotiations, not perhaps at the beginning, but at some stage, are absolutely vital. One is that the end will have to be a compromise. Nobody's going to deliver everything. Things have happened. Wars change things. And you participate in the results only in the process of extremely hard bargaining. And the other is that negotiations really take place along two tracks. One is the visible official track of haggling over borderlines, people, money, or what have you. The other is an invisible one. That is the process of conciliation. Now, you don't really conciliate after long and bitter memories. But the process begins by beginning to understand or perhaps find a little more predictable the other side. And that can take place only by the give and take of very tough negotiation. Having said this, we must not hide the fact that the risks that all sides take in entering this are enormous. And again, I criticize this very easy statement by people who are far away. Come and start negotiating. Israel takes a different risk from the Arabs. Israel's external risk is relatively small. I know that Israel is focused on the problem of security, which is understandable, but they are practically hysterical about it. In fact, some of my Israeli friends have said you have to be hysterical to live in Israel. Well, this lies in the geography and the history, not only of Israel, but of the Jewish people. It's understandable. But externally, Israel is the fourth largest military power in the world. It's very difficult to challenge that. But there's an internal security. Israel, as many of you know, travel there is becoming increasingly polarized. the dissensions, the differences are extremely sharp. You have now an element of Jewish terrorism. Well, why not? Jews are people like other people. They have fascists, terrorists, burglars, saints, like anybody else. But the fact is that a serious negotiation, as I think the Labour Alliance is prepared, on the question of territorial division will be deeply divisive. In Israel, some people speak of near civil war. That may be a little exaggerated. It is not an easy thing to do. And of course, since Mr. Peres has been out of office for several years, the question arises, is he going to be strong enough to face up to such a tough situation? Personally, I say, nobody ever knows. Who knew what a great president Harry Truman would turn out to be before? It is in the fire of reality and danger that the character of men and women is shown. Now, this is one type of risk, and it should not be minimized for a moment. The easy political way is to do nothing. And people in Washington, where I live, there are lots of politicians who are great experts at doing nothing. Now, for Jordan, and this is true in varying degrees to other countries, the risk is mind-boggling. It is virtually impossible for the monarchy or even the state to survive if it goes into negotiation until it has a very good idea approximately what will come out. The failure is killing. And in the Middle East, when you lose, it's not just that you lose office, you lose other important parts. They have seen what happened to Saddam, who after all headed a far more important country, and who failed in what he really was after, because Saddam was not after the Sinai. That is a great mistake. He was after the opportunity to come back to the Arab world as a hero, and for that he needed a compromise on Palestine. Now, Sinai is an Egyptian problem, a bilateral problem between Israel and Egypt. It is not an Arab problem. The other part, the unfulfilled part of Camp David, is what he was after, and of course in the end he lost his life, as you all very well know. So what is necessary is an extremely subtle process, which is to feel out the situation. And the last thing we want, the last thing we need is another ignorant special negotiator. First of all, the position itself, by its nature, makes it high visibility. This is not the time for high visibility. This is time for a process which is not native to the American soil, namely discretion. Secondly, you don't know whether you want to go official. Therefore, there is a lot of feeling out, cajoling, going in between, from which you can pull back before the governments concerned, including our government, feel confident that the political risks, and we also have a political risk, less so than the countries in the area, can take it. This is a very delicate thing. And while this is not my subject, I cannot but emphasize here that in such a delicate situation, you don't want to put in an indelicate item. And one of those mind-boggling things which can blow everything sky high is the Jerusalem bill, that is the idea of transferring the embassy. Now, in some other time, one could discuss it, discuss the various merits. But I assure you, knowing that part of the world for 25 years as I do, this is an explosive item. And as the Israeli government, the Jewish lobby wasn't even so keen on it at the beginning. There were politicians who played their own games, and suddenly it is full-blown. No peace is possible in the Middle East without a participation of the United States, despite the loss of prestige that we have covered in our misadventure, to put it mildly, in Lebanon. But we are the only country that can do it, that is in a position to do that, and our credibility would be nil if this bill passed, or even if there were a sense of the Congress here. Because the emotion on this is indescribable. When a young and inexperienced Prime Minister of Canada made the proposal that he would change the Canadian embassy, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia told him that they would cut relations. And I hear exactly the same thing, however close our relations are, how many interests are involved here. I think without going too far into the subject, I would quote what the New York Times, certainly a great friend of Israel, said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." And it would do nothing for Israel, it would change nothing, but it would do an enormous amount of harm to a delicate situation. And this is why the Reagan administration, perhaps the most pro-Israeli administration we have had, is so totally opposed to it. Therefore, there will be no law, because the president made it very clear that he would veto it. And if it came as a sense of the Congress resolution, of course, you cannot veto it, you can ignore it, and he would ignore it, of that I'm absolutely sure. But it would still do a lot of damage. Now, back to the main subject. One of the very difficult issues involved here for Jordan is that Jordan is a weak country. And King Hussein, with whom I've had long conversation on that subject, is very much aware that 60% of the Jordanian population now are Palestinians. Now, this does not make Jordan Palestine, but there is this part of the population. And that to go ahead without a Palestinian approval is politically impossible, just as many things are impossible for our president without various types of political approval. King Hussein is determined to this time pin this elusive and evasive character Yasser Arafat to his skirts. Well, King doesn't wear skirts, but to his position. And that complicates the situation, because while the Labour government, if there is a Labour government in Israel, is willing, eager to negotiate with Jordan, and I think there is something of the same on the other side that in many contexts. The PLO is another matter. This is a complicated thing into which I don't want to go too deeply, although I'll be glad to answer the question. But it is a complication. But, you know, when I was back in '79, I wrote an article which wasn't widely noticed until I became head of the Reagan transition. That made me prominent. I never really dug into what I had written. And for 3 days, the Israeli press raked me over the coals because of one sentence in which I said, I thought quite unexceptionally, that if you want peace, you have to talk to the people who carry guns. Now, this was expressed much more clearly and courageously by Philip Klotznik, the former president of the World Jewish Congress in Great Britain, former Secretary of Commerce, who put it, I wish I had thought of it, in the form, peace is made among enemies. Peace is not made among friends. And there it is. But it is a complicating situation. Now, I say this without joy. No, a doctor tells you you have pneumonia, doesn't wish it on you, he just tells you you're sick. And the Middle East is sick. What about the role of Syria? Those of you who read my article in the winter issue of Foreign Affairs know my views, how we really played into Syrian hand. I want to emphasize, not only after I have seen President Assad, Saddam, and the others, but as something that really every expert of the Middle East knows, Syria is not a Soviet surrogate. Very few countries in the world are real satellites. Even on the eastern side, not every country is a full satellite. But there is a unity of interest between Syria and the Soviet Union, which is very strong. And when I was in Moscow, and again in our return talks here, the Soviets said soberly, and these were private discussions, where one speaks a little more openly than when one has to go boilerplate. We have a right to be in the Middle East. We don't deny your rights. You're Americans. You have a legitimate interest. But we are 50 miles, 100 miles from our border in the Middle East. You are not going to drive us out any more than you will again drive us out after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Syria is our only window to the Middle East, and we will put in there or anywhere else, whatever it takes, weapons and what have you. Now, the question is, can we match that? Can we drive them out? I think not. Clearly, the Syrians have no other place to go. When the Egyptians tossed out the Russians, they had another place to go. The Syrians are not in that position. They have no alternative. And the question is only, would the Russians participate in settlement, or are they simply out to sabotage? And that, of course, is a very complicated question. Another issue is the role of Egypt. It is ridiculous to think of Israel or any other external country to balance Syria, if that is what you want. The only country that can balance Syria is Egypt. And the history of the Middle East has been around the question of the two centers, Damascus and Cairo. Egypt is coming back to the Arab fold, but determined to keep its peace with Israel, cold peace, because it has to have a cold peace to get back in the Arab fold. It is in our interest. It is in Israel's interest. Again, the Labour Party understands this better, but these are electoral things also, that there is a gain in having an Arab country which has made peace and is determined to keep peace, however cold, with Israel, return gradually to the Arab fold. All this is extraordinarily difficult, and it is difficult for us because we have lost a great deal in Lebanon. It was not that we pulled out. That was foreordained. I've written about it a year before it happened, and most experts in the government and outside knew that there was no way in which we could win it. What really deprived us of prestige was that we first hyped it up in our oratory to a crisis of worldwide importance, and then we pulled out, thereby combining the disadvantages of two courses for action. Finally, why should we bond? Haven't enough prestige been destroyed? Haven't enough disappointments been suffered? Well, there is one reason, and conviction of this is growing both in the West, in the Middle East, including Israel. And that is, there is in the Middle East a growing wave of bitterness and resentment which is inchoate, unfocused, based on many things, many disappointments, many feelings of humiliation, real or other, economic problems, what have you. It is this growing wave of revolutionary Islam in different forms. It's not Shia, it's not Iranian, although it feeds on what has happened in Iran very powerfully, which is ready to take the heritage of the nationalists. And there is a growing opinion of specialists in Israel who realize, as well as I do and many others, that if some credible progress is not made towards peace, I'm not saying we have to have peace tomorrow or even in 85. A conflict that has lasted so long is not going to be settled that fast. But if there is not some hope issued that the progress is possible, then the nationalist movement will be inherited by the fundamentalists, and then everything goes down to destruction. One of the most well-known Arab public figures, writer, journalist, whose name I don't want to mention, who is anything but and fundamentalists, we discussed this over whiskey. Well, it was a spiritual discussion. He said to me, it almost came out of him, we are all sitting on a volcano. Nobody knows where the spark will come from. Nobody needs to organize. He referred to the bread riot in Egypt, which happened when the price of bread went up a couple of cents. Nobody organized it, but it was the spark thrown into the powder keg and flared up, and we've had this in other countries. We don't know who's going to organize it, but the most likely people to profit from it are the fundamentalists. Not because they are so numerous, or they are better organized, but because fundamentalism is understood by the masses. It is the outlet to which they can all repay. And because that danger is so great for everybody who lives there, Arabs and Israelis, even for the West, certainly for the West, that we cannot afford the luxury to go to sleep. And after our election is over, after the Israeli election is over, after everybody is getting out of the agglomeration of nonsense that is going to be produced from now till November, and can again take a calm look, another look has to be taken at the situation. The answer to the question, in short, is peace possible? Yes, barely. There's a great deal of effort by everybody under certain circumstances. But hopeless, no. Hopeless it is not. Thank you very much.
Answer questions until 10 minutes after 7.
That's your doing, no, not mine.
I told him he couldn't speak any longer than 10 minutes after 7. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, you described the central issue in the Middle East is the Palestinian problem. There was just a book written by John Peters called Time Immemorial, who completely refutes your statement. You also described the fact, or you also said that there's much greater chance for peace in the July 23rd elections in Israel if there's a victory for the Labor Party, which apparently you're endorsing.
No,
by
I
your
don't.
remarks.
Good God, I am not an Israeli. I don't
From
endorse parties in
1967,
other
sir,
countries.
and I'd like you to explain or contradict me if you feel so inclined. The Labor Party was from 1967 to the election of Menachem Begin and the Likud Party, the ruling power in Israel, in fact, since 1948. They built 2/3 of the settlements.
1/3.
I
Less,
think
25%.
numerically 2/3. Okay. And so I would like you to explain, sir, why Joan Peters, who says that the central problem in the Middle East is she calls it the irrational hatred by the Arab states of the State of Israel and their desire to destroy the State of Israel, which you described. You said they don't have much of an external problem in your remarks. I wrote them down. I think they have you said they have a small problem. The problem is life and death. And Joan Peters picks up this theme. I'd like you to explain the differences you have with Joan Peters.
Well, Joan Peters went from one distortion to another distortion, and I think very little of the book. She makes a great deal out of the fact that at some time in the past, the area was thinly populated. This was the same in Algeria, where it was only after the French took over that a great deal of influx took place. But what are the facts? And what are the emotions? At the time when the Balfour Declaration was pronounced in 1917, the great majority of the people of Palestine were Arabs. At the time the State of Israel was declared an independent state, the great majority of the area were Arab. I think Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, put it very wisely and profoundly when he said that the difference between Israelis and Arabs is not a difference between right and wrong, but between right and right. This is a great wisdom, and therein lies the answer in all the prophets. The tragedy of the Middle East is that you have two peoples contesting over the same ground. And the only possible answer is a conflict. Until that time comes, the hatred, tension, the desire to destroy, and it is on both sides, will continue. And the measure of my approach is, what has happened has happened. We cannot put the toothpaste back into the tube. I'm interested in what can happen from here on, not on what happened years ago, which I cannot change. I find in the Arab world a recognition, grudging, to be sure, that Israel cannot be wished away. A recognition that America will always be on the side of Israel. Those are gradually becoming to be the givens. I find in Israel a growing recognition that the present situation of simply ruling the million or slightly less Arabs and having either a South Africa, which Ben Gurion envisaged, or some other unsatisfactory situation is always also unsatisfactory. Now, there are many Israelis who feel differently. There are many Arabs who feel different. But I see growing after trips every year to the entire Arab world and to Israel, I see the change. Perhaps one sees it more easily when one is away for a while and then comes back. And the question is now, can there be a compromise solution? And I see one side of Israeli public opinion, which seems to be supported not by a majority, but certainly by a growing plurality, to the extent that one can trust public opinion polls, supporting that road, and also a similar but more complicated and more difficult to measure because we don't have democracies on the other side. So all that can be said, and that was the purpose of my talk, is there is a chance with very careful, prudent, probing, little publicity, seeing whether it can be done. I can be proved wrong. But I think the chance is there and ought to be used. And therefore the interpretation of why happened in the past, we can spend all night on that, and I would be very happy to dispute Ms. Peters on many of the details, but that is not relevant. The relevant is you have what you have. You have the need. You have the dissatisfaction, you have the feeling that something has to change. And can we do something about it? My view is yes, barely. Good luck.
Rabbi Polnikov.
Mr. Ambassador, you so cavalierly dismissed John Peters despite the fact that she has well documented what she said. And I don't understand why, if you say you're not interested in what happened in the past, why you dwell upon it so much. But the view that you have presented is not the same that we get from independent sources that are perhaps more reliable, perhaps unreliable. For one, the Palestinian question. For 19 years, when Jordan had the West Bank, there was no problem of Palestinian rights. There was no problem about Jerusalem. And there was no peace negotiation. The fact of the matter is that when you ridiculed Menachem Begin so much, the fact of the matter is that Ben Gurion visited this Labor Department, never could negotiate with the Arabs. Menachem Begin did. He was the only one who did. And as a matter of fact, if the United States, with its Arabs and the State Department, would have kept their hands off of the whole thing and their mouths shut, then Sadat and Begin would have arrived at a solution. I have here a clipping from an editorial that appeared in the News American. It was all over the same country at that time when Sadat came to Jerusalem in order to negotiate. And what they said specifically, if you want to, I will show it to you. I don't want to take all the time of reading it. But the fact of the matter is, Jimmy Carter wanted to get the credit of a breakthrough, of getting some kind of negotiation started, and he was talking about Geneva. The fact of the matter is that Sadat stole his fire, and he resented it. And what he did was, he tried to pour cold water on the whole deal, and he tried to kill the whole deal. Subsequently, we found from Mark Siegel, who was his representative, that he was sent specifically for that purpose. He reported to us to throw cold water on it because it was stealing his thunder. And this is the thing that has been going on constantly. You present another view.
I think Rabbi Polyakov is the question.
The question is, in the face of all these independent sources, we want to know why it is that the Arabists in the State Department consistently insist that the only way to deal with this problem is to constantly put pressure on Israel, and never once thinking that the Arabs are the ones who have been the stumbling block in the whole process.
Well, this is a picture which does not accord with my view, quite obviously. I'm not a career Foreign Service officer, but I am on the side of the State Department. Both sides have to be brought together, and that means pressure, whatever the particular situation is. As far as the Camp David process is concerned, I have gone over that. I was not in the government at that time, but I've just returned from Tunisia with Mr. Brzezinski. We went over the day-by-day events, and they were not as you portrayed. As you remember, when Sadat, in this electrifying moment, spoke before the Knesset, what point did he stress? Did he stress the Sinai? No. He stressed the Palestinian. And that is, whether you want it or not, and whether you stand on your head, that is the central problem, together with the security and the recognition of Israel. And nothing changes that, or has changed. Now, I'm not a Democrat. However, President Carter, whose weakness was that he changed positions rather frequently, his idea, which went around the block sometimes, was to solve the problem by a joint process. One part was the bilateral Egyptian-Israeli deal, which led to peace and the change of the Sinai. The other was the solution of the Palestinian problem. And that the American and Egyptian negotiators tried to approach by putting into the center Resolution 242 and 338 of the United Nations, which provides for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from occupied territory. The word "the" was left out in order not to say that it has to be from every part of the territory, but there is no question, absolutely no question, because the Israeli government, which negotiated that, especially Mr. Abba Eban, who has written about this, as well as the late Mrs. Meir, have said without any question that, of course, the West Bank was included, though not necessarily all parts of the West Bank, in the definition of 242. Mr. Menachem Begin changed that definition even before Camp David by saying the West Bank is not occupied but liberated territory. Therefore, the whole issue of Camp David was decided. Now, nobody viewed the Camp David agreement that way except Mr. Begin. The Americans did not. The Egyptians did not. Therefore, when this definition came up, the agreement came apart, and there was no bridge. And it was President Reagan who, in his declaration of the 1st of September 82, tried to reform that bridge. In other words, complete, as I see, the Camp David agreement by speaking of a Jordanian or similar solution together with security and so forth for Israel. That was the plan at that time. And this is where we are. And unless we find some way to that which both the Democratic and the Republican administration have attempted, then there will be no peace. No? Of course, one can live without peace. Do we want to? Well, that's another matter. Well, I can't go any more deeply into this. There are many other questions.
Professor Friedman.
Ambassador Neumann, I share your limited optimism as the possibility.
Which part? The optimism?
Well, the limited optimism that I think extracted from your talk tonight as the possibility that maybe negotiations will begin given a Labor Party victory on July 23rd. And assuming, if I may just draw you out a little further, that by November, the time of the American elections, the Labor Party will put together a coalition government, so after that, things might be ready to start moving. I wonder if you would care to try to project ahead as the dynamics within the PLO, because as you mentioned, King Hussein can't move by himself, yet Arafat, despite the split off by Abu Musa, has hesitated, and perhaps he's hesitating until after the elections. Do you feel that given some Labor Party readiness and after the American elections, there's a real possibility that the PLO might split, dropping the rejectionists and possibly moving on toward a settlement?
I should point out, Professor Friedman has written a magnificent study in Lebanon and is very knowledgeable on the subject, and the question is a very pertinent one. I think Yasser Arafat is closer to this than he was. But he's a pretty slippery man, and he has kept alive politically and physically by constantly shifting position, which, as you know, is not an unusual approach in the Middle East, which makes it so endlessly fascinating, except when you wake up with a nightmare. The position of the PLO, that is the center. Let me say first, perhaps, that Abu Musa has basically failed because he had too much, obviously, the support of Syria. And I think you have said that in your writings. But what the game plan is, as I understand it, and there are so many game plans among Palestinians, it's difficult to, is to get a recognition, I hope I can reproduce this, a recognition of the identity of the Palestinians, both in the negotiating team and in the final solution, and then have a pre-cooked solution in which you have a confederation. Now that's a very complicated thing. I can see 100 ways in which this can go apart 15 times a day. But this is where things stand now. Now, King Hussein feels he cannot go forward without a what in Catholic parlance would call an imprimatur, authoritative permission from the Palestinian, and whether you want it or not, the PLO is representative of the PLO, of the Palestinians, not because they're nice, but because they are the activists and carrying out what Mao Zedong called that action comes from the barrel of a gun. This is a political reality, highly unpleasant, but there. If Arafat gets the majority in the Palestinian National Council, then there is a possibility of progress there. But for that, many people feel the Palestinians on the National Council who live on the occupied West Bank have to be permitted to go to Tunis. And while the Israelis would be only too happy to let them go out, the question is whether they would let them come back. At the present moment, I get the impression they would not. After the election, who knows? There are, among the labor people, you know, many different views. There are people who are as dead set against any PLO as Likud, and you have all the way to the peace now. Whether this problem can be finessed, I don't know. It is certainly it is recognized that the opposition to have the PLO have anything to do with peace or the negotiations is far broader than Likud, and this is a major problem that the outcome of which I do not know. But you know, if I am right. Naturally, I'm convinced that I am, because what would I be doing here if I were not? That the Palestinian problem is the center. Then to negotiate the future of the Palestinians without Palestinians is an absurdity. And this is what Mr. Klutznik said. That he said you have to make peace between enemies. I'm not going quite that far, but this is one of the 15 complicated problems, and these are problems which change. If, for instance, I'm now fantasizing, this is not happening. If, for instance, King Hussein had confidence that really something credible is possible, and the Israeli government felt, well, there is some possibility, and it will lead to some kind of territorial revision, the Alon plan or something. Well, then the PLO will have to think how it can get its part under those circumstances. And I could not predict a situation which is several stages in the future. Whether the PLO position is a permanent stumbling block depends also what position other Arab countries take, because the PLO is isolated from all Arab countries, but trying to play a role in them, in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so forth. So there's a great deal of work to be done. It would even be contrary to, it would not be useful if we were trying now to write an exact plan. That has to arise out of negotiations which may take years. Your question was clearer than my answer. But I can only say that is as I see it as of now.
Yes, sir. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned the fact that we supplied AWACS and F-15s to Saudi Arabia. That was to repel invasion and so forth. What is the position of the fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia, and particularly in view of the fact that they had a slight insurrection in which they holed up in the temple, and it took thousands and thousands of Pakistani soldiers to get them out of the temple?
Well, you're right on the basic note. It wasn't Pakistanis, others. But it lasted 2 weeks, and it was serious, 79. However, it was not a spark that jumped anywhere else. And it was not all Saudis. There were Saudis, there were some Iranians, there were Somalis, there were all kinds of people. There were also tribal problems. The leadership was in a tribe which had been long opposed to the Saudi. It was a complicated thing, but it did happen, and it jolted the family very profoundly. But it had no follow-up. And I, having lived in Saudi Arabia, I regard that regime as perhaps the most solid in the Middle East. It is unique. No other country has it. It is a system of constant adjustment among opposites, within the family, with others. It is perhaps the typical way in which a country which is rich but weak, because there are only 5 million people there, adjusts itself, but they are masters in that. There are, of course, strains, as you would expect, but in a sense, Mecca incident was benign because it revealed to the ruling family what they did not know, namely that the danger was not only the left but also on the right. On the other hand, the Shiite population of Saudi Arabia, which is in the eastern provinces, and which is only about 300,000, sizable because they work in the oil field, have also had disturbances, but on entirely different grounds. And the Saudis have not, in the beginning at least, been too skillful in handling that, but they have learned. There's an impressive learning capability here. I think the next strain will come when the next generation, which is highly educated, mostly American educated, comes to power. But I regard the solidity of Saudi Arabia superior to that of any other country in that region. I am not that worried about Saudi Arabia. Of course, I can be wrong, but I don't think so.
Mr. Blumberg. Mr. Blumberg is next, then you, sir.
Well, in your discussion, you have placed a great deal of emphasis on the Israelis not being willing to show their hand prior to negotiations. You have suggested that territorial compromise be necessary. In doing that, remember when Shimon Peres led the presidency in England, and Shimon Peres asked the king, what do you want in order to sit down and negotiate? The king said, I have to have every square meter investment not the fact, because if I don't, I will be considered particularly not a traitor to my people. Now, is this the type of preconditions territorial negotiations have in mind?
No. I got the version of this from both gentlemen. Without going into what they told me, if either side wants everything, there are no negotiations. Negotiations can end only in compromise. King Hussein will assert to the last minute that he must have everything. And if he persists in this, there will be no negotiation. If the Israelis say that we will give nothing, there will be no negotiation. The negotiating perimeter lies between the two. But if both sides gradually, and that may take quite a while, come to the conclusion that a compromise of some kind, it won't be that clear at that stage, is feasible, then the positions, as they do in negotiations, will gradually shift. That is the purpose of negotiation. Because both sides take great risks in this for reasons that I've explained. I feel that the process has to be informal before there is enough evidence that progress can be made before it can turn into an official one. And I cannot foresee how long that would take. This is being discussed in many parts, but I repeat, no negotiation except surrender can lead to any one side getting everything. I think it is visionary to believe that one can simply roll back the frontiers to 67. It is visionary to believe that the Arab resistance will simply go away if Israel keeps everything. So it's in that terrain in between where more and more people in the Middle East have, I think in Israel as well, and prominently so, made up their minds that some progress is necessary. I'm always struck how much freer and more open the discussion of this issue is in Israel than in the United States. But that is another tough story.
Yes, sir. The gentleman in the last here.
Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to make a comment and answer the question. I appreciate your remarks here tonight. I think that they have shed a ray of light on a very murky situation. I would like to ask you if you felt that if the Israelis would recognize PLO on a quid pro quo basis, if this would have any effect on bringing negotiations to a head. It would seem that if the Israelis are, in reality, I think it's correct, the fourth strongest military power in the world, it's ludicrous for them to say they will not recognize the PLO unless the PLO abolishes their cause. And they're refusing to say that they want to.
Well, I don't believe in concessions without a quid pro quo. I don't expect Israel to recognize the PLO without a quid pro quo from the other side. This is simply not done, because why should you give away your negotiating cards for negotiation stuff when you might negotiate towards it? Now, fear is not only physical but psychological. Israel is very secure, as they have proven many times, from anything that the PLO can do. Nevertheless, there is the history of the extermination of Jewish people by Hitler. There is the life in insecurity in Israel. Even though 10 months before the invasion of Lebanon by Israel, which was a tragedy and a fantastic error, there was not one shot fired across the border. The negotiation, the agreement to cease fire that was negotiated by my distinguished colleague Ambassador Habib held, but the element of fear, the memory of the terror, or the killing of children and occupation school, you know the whole story, is there. It is a reality, and you cannot blame people to feel insecure even if weapons come out of their ears. It is not a objective thing, it's a subjective one. This is a fact. To the Arabs, Israel is the great aggressor. That is also a subjective fact. And you can argue whether it's historical or so or not. It leads you nowhere, because in politics, what you feel is it. The question is to break this deadlock by a process of negotiations, which in its wake gradually establishes confidence. General de Gaulle once explained to me in a long conversation, which I will never forget, before he returned to being the president of France, what he would do about Algeria. And I just came from Algeria, and he gave a fascinating description of how each step that has to be taken has to create a psychological change on the other side, on which then the next step is based. This is part of negotiation. And the older and the longer the process, the crisis has lasted, the more complicated, the more long-lasting it will be. But there has been peace between countries that were believed that they were in perpetual and hereditary hostility, France and Germany. But the situation has changed, many things have changed, and it is not impossible, and nothing stands still in the Middle East nor anywhere else. I'm not optimistic. I am saying a window of opportunity will open possibly for a short time. Will we, Israelis, the Arabs, American government, have the imagination and the courage to make use of it? Well, we do not know exactly how it will open, if it does open. Now, I have projected before you a certain scenario, but when the elections in Israel are over and the elections here are over, it will not be quite that way. Reality is always a little different from projection. Well, then only can you set your sights on the next step. But recognition, I think that has to be earned, negotiated. I don't believe much among tough people that you simply throw the cards on the table and hope that the other guy will say, well, you're a great guy, I'm going to go. See, that's not the way it's done. That, I think, is feasible farther down. The action is really primarily between Jordan, Egypt, perhaps Saudi Arabia, and Israel, with the PLO playing a role, the dimension of which is at the moment difficult for us. I don't mean to be unnecessarily complicated, but we're talking about a complicated situation. But if you do nothing, if you say you all go away, well, you know what's
We're going to have time for just a couple more questions. I apologize to so many of you who had your hands up. But let me suggest, sir, that you ask the first of 3 questions. You, ma'am, have been very patient. The second, you, sir, the third, and we'll...
That's why I asked you to do this, you know.
the rest
I have trouble enough.
Mr. Ambassador, you spoke at great length about the Palestinian question as being the crux of the whole matter, and yet you have never mentioned one word about the many, many more Jews who were expelled from Arab countries in the same light at all. You never even mentioned them. And I would like to also ask you why you have criticized the government of Israel so highly when you cannot find one Arab government which will sit down and negotiate a peace or even come to a table with Israel, and yet you question that. And then you made the misstatement, I think, that the Zionism began in 1940.
Oh, I didn't say that. Oh, never mind. It's not important, but I never said it. I know the history of Herzl and so.
The point is that my question is, if you ask Jerry Falwell or some...
I am not going to. Please forgive me. I shouldn't have. I apologize. I shouldn't interrupt you.
In the Bible, of any Bible, you will see that the land was given by God to Moses, and after the Exodus from Egypt, and I'd like to know why you say that it's a recent event.
Well, there were several questions here. I'm not going to get into theological discussion. I am a Christian. I believe in the Bible, but I don't read it quite the same as Reverend Falwell. In fact, I don't know what I read like General Falwell. Of course, many Jews were expelled, but not all were expelled. I was American ambassador to Morocco. There's still a sizable, though much reduced, Jewish community there. The Jews were not expelled from Morocco. They chose to leave. And any member of the Moroccan community still living there, and many of those old enough to remember, and some of them, you know, travel back with rather good feelings towards the king and his late father, will testify to that. I was in Yemen a couple of years ago, and there is a very complicated history of the departure. Some were pushed, some were not. There was, but the Iraqis certainly were pushed out. So in each case you have a different, but you are quite right in saying that in any final settlement, the rights of those who lost their homes in the Arab lands would also have to be taken into consideration. This has been long discussed. I have no problem, but I do not see an exact issue here of what I was talking about. I'm talking about a situation that is dangerous and which is made use of by many sentiments, including the Soviet Union. I believe every American government since, well, certainly the Eisenhower administration has tried to make progress, and it's part of the American political scene that once new administration comes and has gone through a year of learning that history did not begin on inauguration day, that it zeroes in trying to do something